There's an awful lot of talk about verticals. And to be fair, 5G at least has been better than 4G at engaging other industries in the upfront discussions. Now, there's a big gap between having the discussions and actually generating outcomes which look like services. I suppose the question here is whether it's the traditional operators we're talking about, or whether it's new classes of operators, or whether it's the technology vendors. Certainly one of the things I've seen from all of the large network equipment vendors recently is increasing push towards not just looking at traditional telcos, but also on new forms of service provider. But I think that before we do that, I think the first things we're going to see for 5G are probably going to actually be in the fixed wireless domain. There's a lot of people talking about using 5G for a drop for the last maybe couple hundred meters from a fibre node, whether that's to a house or whether that's to an apartment block. And so I think that there, if you like, that's sort of a business application if you take the property company as a business rather than the sort of individual consumers as tenants. But in terms of the verticals is a very broad term. It can mean anything from a geographically well-defined location like an airport or an oil refinery, or it can mean something which is inherently national or international or mobile, like vehicles, for example. There's people talking about drones with cellular connections for security and sort of flight tracking and data collection purposes for some governments. A lot of discussion around healthcare, manufacturing. That's where it gets more difficult. I can't really imagine that you're going to have a car manufacturing plant in 5-6 years' time where the robot anti-collision software is running on an operator's edge computing node next to their small cell inside the factory. If you're Ford or your GM or whoever, you probably want to have that under your own control. You want the data on your servers, whether you call it an edge compute node or something else. And you might even want to run the network yourself, or you get your equipment and robot company, ABB, let's say, or a Honeywell or control system provider. And so then there's a whole bunch of dynamics as to who is running the network, who owns the spectrum, who runs the sort of core of the, who does the numbering and systems. There's lots of permutations there. So I can see 5G having some uses there, because you're not necessarily going to use Wi-Fi and unlicensed spectrum for everything. But I'm equally not so certain that that's particularly going to be where the traditional cellular operators play. AI is a huge, expansive term. It's obviously one of the biggest buzzwords, and there's lots of separate sort of manifestations of AI. So anything from sort of image recognition and video analysis through to machine and deep learning on big data sets, through to pattern recognition. So there's a lot of different branches of this overall sort of analytics and intelligence space, sometimes called cognitive as well. For me, there's probably three things which are most important for telecoms. One is customer interface. And customer management, and that can be things like chatbots, voice recognition. It can self-help, for example, helping users fix their Wi-Fi problems and try to reduce the workload on the contact center. There's things like looking for predictions of churn. Yeah, essentially it's about the customer management, customer experience, CRM, and there's lots of sort of side issues to that as well. Then there's operational AI, perhaps less glamorous, but I think it's really important, where you're going to be creating huge amounts of data from the network in itself and its day-to-day operation. What its load factors are, what the response times are, whether there's any faults, anomalies in behavior, and that should really be useful for operators in things like capacity planning, in terms of troubleshooting their own network, and also doing more advanced forms of sort of network optimization. For example, you could have a network that is in a sports stadium and it knows that the pattern of where the users are and what they're doing is very different during a match when people are sending photos or videos to Snapchat or whatever it happens to be, and then they're out at the in the break buying drinks and hamburgers and perhaps maybe doing mobile transactions or something like that, checking their email. And then again, when they leave at the end of the match, that rather than being seated in the stadium, they're out in the atriums, on the stairs, and so perhaps you might reconfigure the beamforming in 5G or 4G up to a point to rebalance where the capacity is. The last aspect of AI, if you like, that's maybe the poachers rather than the gamekeepers. And I think that the challenge for the telecoms industry is that their users will have AI as well. And so I think that the user or application side AI, well, for a start, maybe I'll have my AI negotiate my renewal contract on my behalf, because they've used a million other data points to know exactly what the right things to say to the renewals and retentions people are to get the best deal. It could equally well be that, for Internet of Things, the AI works out, when do I really need to use the network? Can I process the data locally? Do I have enough compute power in the car, in the phone even, that I don't need to use the network and the cloud as much? I can actually do most of the stuff at the edge. And that, if you like, that could have a negative impact on the need for network connectivity in some cases. We're going to be hearing a lot more about 5G, and I think there's going to be good news and bad news. I think there's going to be some early deployments, and we'll have lots of press releases about the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang in South Korea. There's probably some fixed access in North America, Verizon or AT&T, for example. And so I think we'll have plenty to sort of keep us occupied with the sort of 5G hype momentum. But I also starting to see some reality starting to come into the 5G sector. And I think 2018 is going to be where that's going to hit quite hard, to realise that whilst those niche use cases are quite palatable, quite valuable and short term, the mass market adoption of 5G for all sorts of reasons is going to be a lot more tricky, because the best description I heard was the use cases are there but the business case isn't. And I think also there's going to be a lot of still wrangling in a lot of countries over what spectrum is going to be used, how much the patents cost on chipsets for each device, whether the sort of the Internet of Things use cases are realistic for several years, because we're going to have islands of 5G in an ocean of 4G. For the foreseeable future. There is not going to be anywhere on the planet that's going to be a 5G only network, including indoors, for several years, if not many years. And that means that all of the things that people talk about 5G use cases, they'll only work in small areas. And then we come back to the question we had before about verticals as to whose network is it in those well-defined areas.